"You're just a little too ethnic for this crowd, Mom." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. My daughter, Isabella, stood before me in a dress that cost more than my first car. Her face a mask of strained politeness as she looked from me to her fiancé's perfect family. I glanced down at my hand-embroidered dress, its vibrant colors telling stories of my village stories that had become, in her eyes, a source of shame. All my sacrifices scrubbing floors, working double shifts. Crossing desserts had led to this moment where my very heritage was unwelcome at her celebration. The world seemed to stop as I saw the pained embarrassment in her eyes. It wasn't hatred that broke my heart, it was pity. I didn't fight or cause a scene. I simply turned and walked out of that mansion, the sound of her relieved sigh following me out the door like a final, gentle push into the abyss. The click of my heels on the polished marble was the only sound I made, a hollow, retreating beat. I didn't look back. To see her standing there, surrounded by her new world, would have been a second death. The bus ride home passed in a blur of streetlights and silent tears. Strangers' faces flashed by, each one seemingly anchored to lives and loves I could no longer claim. My embroidered dress felt garish in the muted interior, a splash of unwanted color. I clutched my purse, feeling the weight of my house Keitha, only thing that still felt truly mine. In my small, quiet apartment, the silence was deafening. It wasn't an empty silence, but a heavy, living one, filled with the ghosts of all our yesterdays. The air still smelled faintly of the cumin and paprika I'd cooked with yesterday, a scent that now felt like a relic from a lost civilization. I locked the door behind me, the simple, familiar click, a pathetic defense against the devastation within. I didn't even turn on the main light. The dim glow from the street lamp outside was enough to see the contours of my life, small and shrunken. I sank into my worn armchair, the fabric giving way with a familiar sigh. The embroidered dress now felt like a costume of a foolish old woman, a garish attempt to belong in a world that had no space for my kind of vibrancy. I tore at the delicate fabric, pulling the zipper down with a frantic urgency, needing to be free of its suffocating weight. In my simple slip, I finally felt I could breathe, though each breath was a ragged, painful thing. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, inevitably drawn to the photos on my mantelpiece. There was Isabella's first day of school, her small hand clutching mine. Her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, looking to me for courage. There she was, at her high school graduation, her smile brilliant and proud. Her gaze already looking past me, toward a future I couldn't fully imagine. Her smiling face in each frame was a constant, aching reminder of a love I thought was as solid and unconditional as the earth itself. Now, that earth had crumbled into dust. That night, I hit the bottom. The woman who had crossed an ocean with little but a dream, who had worked 3 jobs while raising a child, who had faced down prejudice and loneliness without flinching, felt utterly broken. It wasn't hardship that finally shattered me. It was the casual, almost unconscious cruelty of the person who was my entire world. The rejection wasn't a battle cry. It was a quiet, dismissive gesture, and that made it infinitely more lethal. A sob escaped me, a raw, guttural sound that seemed to startle the quiet apartment. Then another. I didn't try to stop them. I curled into the chair, my body convulsing with the force of a grief too long suppressed. I was crying for the little girl who used to beg me to sing the old songs. Her small body curled against mine in this very chair. I was crying for the teenager who would roll her eyes at my dramatic stories of home, but whose eyes would secretly gleam with fascination. I was crying for the polished stranger in the beige mansion, for the loss I saw in her own eyes, even if she didn't recognize it. And most painfully, I was crying for myself. For the young woman I had been, full of fire and hope, who believed that sacrifice was a language of love that would always be understood. I felt like I had not only lost my daughter, but that I had failed as a mother. What fatal flaw had I nurtured? What essential lesson had I forgotten to teach? I had raised a daughter who could so easily discard her own roots, who could look at the soil from which she sprang and see only dirt. In trying to give her a better life, had I taught her that the old one was something to be ashamed of? Had my love, in its fierce, all-consuming intensity, somehow smothered the very thing I was trying to preserve? The weight of it pressed down on me, a physical agony. I had built my entire existence on the foundation of being Isabella's mother. Without that, who was I? An immigrant with a faded accent. A cook with no one to feed. A storyteller with no one left to listen. The memories that had once been my treasures now felt like taunting phantoms, proof of a love that had somehow, inexplicably, curdled into pity. The silence of the apartment was no longer just empty, it was accusatory. It was the sound of my own life, echoing back at me, asking a question I had no answer for. If I was no longer her mother, in the way that truly mattered, then what was left of me? The fog of grief that had cocooned me for days seemed to part, not with a tear, but with a simple shift of my gaze. The world, which had been muffled and gray, snapped into a painful, hyperreal focus as my eyes fell upon an old cedar box I hadn't opened in years. Its familiar scent, a ghost from my past I hadn't realized I'd forgotten, filled my nostrils. My trembling fingers traced the grooves of my father's initials AM for Alejandro Morales. He had carved them himself with the same meticulous care he applied to everything, from selecting the ripest coffee cherries to balancing a ledger. The lid creaked open, a sound of protest from a lifetime sealed away. Inside, nestled on faded blue velvet, the color of a forgotten twilight, lay the locket. It was tarnished, a map of neglect etched in silver. But I didn't need to open it to see the tiny portrait of my mother inside, her smile gentle and eternal. But it was the photograph beneath it that stole the air from my lungs. It was me. Not the me I had become, the woman with hands roughened by cleaning solvents and eyes shadowed by compromise, but the me I had been forged to be. Alina Morales at 20, standing ramrod straight before the grand columned facade of our company's headquarters in the capital. Morales Cosechas de Oro was etched in stone above the massive doors, a declaration of permanence and power. My hair was swept back in an elegant chignon, not a single strand daring to defy its place. I wore a severe, impeccably tailored navy suit, my posture not just confident, but commanding. My eyes, staring directly into the camera, held no softness, no flicker of the maternal tenderness I would later pour into my daughter. They were the eyes of a strategist, a successor. The memory didn't trickle back. It flooded, a dam bursting behind my eyes. I saw myself at 12, not playing with dolls, but sitting at my father's massive oak desk. Its surface a landscape of green felt and polished wood. He would lay out maps of shipping routes, his finger tracing the paths from our high-altitude farms to ports in Europe and North America. "The bean is only the beginning, Isabella," he would say, his voice a low, steady rumble. "The true value is in the journey. You must understand the tariffs, the futures market, the fickle hearts of foreign buyers. You must know it better than they do." I was being sculpted from childhood to be the steady hand that would guide our empire, our legacy, into the next generation. The soil of our farm was not just dirt to me, it was the foundation of a kingdom I was born to rule. The memories of the coup surged forth, a shard of glass in my mind. It was not the slow-burning grief I felt for Isabella, but a violent, sudden severing. I saw the soldiers in their mismatched uniforms, their boots muddying the pristine floors of our home. I heard the shouted orders. Saw the look of shattered pride on my father's face as they declared our lands and assets, redistributed for the good of the people. And I remembered the frantic, hushed plans for my escape, because the daughter of Alejandro Morales was a symbol, and symbols were either useful trophies or dangerous liabilities. I had to become a ghost. I fled with little more than the clothes on my back, and this single, hidden box, the sharp, brilliant woman in the photograph was shed like a skin. In this new country, she was a liability. Her confidence could be mistaken for arrogance. Her knowledge for a threat. To survive, I had to bury her. I became soft where I was once sharp, quiet where I was once commanding. I learned the language of menial labor and maternal worry, forgetting the language of international trade and corporate strategy. I poured all that remained of my formidable will into one single fragile vessel. My daughter. A raw, guttural sound escaped my lips, a cross between a sob and a laugh. All these years, I had thought my failure was as a mother. I had agonized over the fatal flaw in my love, the essential lesson I forgot to teach her about roots and respect. But staring at this photograph, at the ghost of my own formidable potential, I saw a different, more devastating truth. In my desperate attempt to give Isabella a safe, unburdened life, I had hidden my own light. I had presented her with a version of myself that was only nurturing, only sacrificial, only small. I had told her folk tales of our homeland, but I had never told her I could have run the company that sourced the beans for those stories. I had taught her to be resilient in school, but I had never shown her the steel-spined resilience it took to build a new life from absolute zero. I had given her a mother who was all heart and no spine. She didn't discard her roots because they were shameful. She discarded them because I had only shown her one tenderized layer. I had given her the soil, but I had hidden the fortress that was built upon it. The polished stranger in the beige mansion didn't pity my past. She pitied the limited, diminished woman she believed was the entirety of my story, and I had let her believe it. The weight in my chest shifted. It was no longer the crushing burden of failure, but the terrifying, electric hum of a forgotten power being switched back on. The silence of the apartment was no longer accusatory. It was waiting. The question still hung in the asterisk. If I was no longer her mother, in the way that truly mattered, then what was left of me? The sadness that had crippled me began to harden, a slow and steady crystallization into resolve. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the television and saw not just a simple cleaning lady, but Elena Morales. The meek, uneducated mother had been a role I'd played for so long, a necessary disguise for survival, that its lines had almost become my own. But the time for that performance was over. My daughter and her new family needed to understand the true weight of the heritage they so carelessly dismissed. This wasn't merely about revenge, it was a reclamation of everything I was and everything she was choosing to erase. The first step was to shed this skin. I walked to my bedroom closet, a small, sad thing filled with beige and gray uniforms of servitude. Pushed to the very back, shrouded in a dry cleaning bag that had yellowed with age, was a single piece of armor, a dress. It was a deep, vibrant crimson, the color of a poinsettia in full bloom, the color of the clay earth back home after a hard rain. The wool was fine, the cut severe and elegant. I had worn it to my final interview at the corporate office in São Paulo, a lifetime ago. I slipped it on now, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was tight across the shoulders and snug around the waist, a testament to the years of physical labor that had hardened my body in a different way. But it fit. My soul, which had been swimming in the shapeless fabric of my grief, snapped back into the contours this dress provided. I didn't look like a mother anymore. I looked like a CEO. The next morning, I didn't go to my usual cleaning assignments. Instead, I took the bus downtown, the crimson dress drawing a few curious glances. My destination was a small, private library that specialized in business archives and corporate histories. I had called ahead, my voice steady and laced with an authority I hadn't used in 2 decades. I gave a name, not my own, but one that would open doors. Tell them Elena Vasquez is here to see the records for Vasquez Global Sourcing. 1998 to 2001. He brought me boxers, his deference a strange and familiar tonic. And then, I began to dig. I pulled out financial reports I had authored. Strategic acquisition plans for coffee and cocoa plantations that bore my signature, my sharp, angular script, a stark contrast to the looping, gentle handwriting Isabella knew from grocery lists. I found photographs of myself standing beside men whose faces were now in financial magazines, my posture not deferential, but equal. In one, I was pointing at a map, my expression one of cool command. I wasn't just remembering, I was assembling evidence. I was building my case. My plan was taking shape, not as a vague notion of confrontation, but as a precise, surgical strike. The annual Kensington Bishop Charity Gala. It was the event of the season for their sterile, moneyed world, a place where they preened and auctioned off Picassos to soothe their consciences. Isabella had mentioned the gala months ago, a casual, almost pitying remark about how over the top it was. I knew she and Charles would be there. It was the perfect stage. Getting an invitation was the easiest part. A few calls, a few old contacts reactivated with the sheer, undiluted force of my resurrected name. The man who now ran the company that had bought mine out, a man who owed his first major promotion to a risk I had taken, was more than happy to accommodate the legendary Elena Vasquez. He didn't know Aite was the same Elena who cleaned his neighbor's toilets. The irony was a dark, private pleasure. The night of the gala, I stood before the full-length mirror in my apartment. The crimson dress had been expertly altered. My silver-streaked hair was swept up in a severe I wore no jewelry except for a single piece, a heavy, pre-Columbian gold cuff that had been my grandmother's. It was raw, unpolished, and utterly real amidst a sea of delicate diamonds. It was my flag. It was my weapon. I arrived at the museum, its grand halls glittering with a cold, manufactured beauty. I moved through the crowd, a splash of blood red in a monochrome sea of black ties and pale gowns. I felt their eyes on me, curious, speculative. Who is she? I didn't look like I belonged to their world, and that was the point. I looked like I could buy it, and then I saw them. Isabella, draped in a silver gown that cost more than my first car, laughing with a tinkling, artificial sound that grated on my soul. Charles was beside her, his hand possessively on her back. They were a perfect, polished tableau. I didn't approach them. Not yet. I walked to the center of the room, to the silent auction display. I found what I was looking for. Lot 47, a weekend at a Napa Valley vineyard owned by one of Charles's business rivals. The opening bid was astronomical. I picked up the pen. The air around me seemed to still. I could feel Isabella's gaze before I saw her turn. It was a physical sensation, a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. I felt her confusion, then her dawning, horrifying recognition. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the board, my expression one a board calculation. I wrote a figure that was double the opening bid. I signed my name not with the messy scrawl she knew, but with the sharp, clean signature from the business reports. Asterisk Elena Vasquez, asterisk then, and only then, did I turn. Our eyes met across the crowded, perfumed space. Her face was a mask of stunned disbelief, her mouth slightly agape. The polished stranger was gone, replaced by my bewildered child. Charles was staring too, his face a comical mixture of confusion and affront. I offered them a small, cold smile. It wasn't the warm, encompassing smile of a mother. It was the smile of a negotiator who has just laid her final card on the table. The lesson had begun. The pen felt heavy in my hand, a weapon far more potent than any accusation I could have screamed across that gilded room. The ink, drying into my newald name, was a declaration of war written in a language they all understood: money. I let the silence stretch, a taut wire between us, vibrating with their shock. I was no longer the ghost at their feast. I was the new architect, here to redesign the very foundation of their world. The murmurs started as I turned away from the board, a soft, buzzing wave that followed my path. I didn't look back at Isabella and Charles. I didn't need to. Their stunned paralysis was a trophy I carried with me. I moved toward the bar, the click of my heels a deliberate, measured cadence against the marble floor. "Sparkling water with lime," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the earthquake happening inside my chest. The bartender, a young man with a practiced, disinterested smile, complied. I took the cool condensation beaded glass and found a vantage point near a colossal ice sculpture that was slowly weeping into a silver basin. My hidden power, as I'd come to think of it, wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a hard-won understanding of high-stakes business, a language I had painstakingly learned by listening. During those long, lonely nights while Charles was working, I would dissect his frustrated rants about competitors and parse his arrogant dismissals of market fluctuations. Without his ever realizing it, he was giving me a masterclass in corporate strategy, and I was becoming its most attentive pupil. When the facade of my life finally crumbled, that knowledge became my shovel. I took the modest savings I had secretly and wisely invested over 30 years' money from a small inheritance I'd never mentioned. Funds from freelance editing work I'd done under a pseudonym began my silent investigation. It wasn't a frantic search for revenge, not at first. It was an archaeological dig into the truth. I hired a discreet financial analyst, a woman named Miriam, who asked no questions and demanded payment in. Her task was to pull every public and private record on Preston's family company, Sterling Holdings. The data arrived in encrypted files, a river of numbers and legal jargon. And as I sifted through it, night after night in my small, rented apartment, the patterns were obvious to my trained eye. The glossy exterior of Sterling Holdings, the legacy Charles was so proud of, was a lie. The company was a house of cards, propped up by risky loans and over-leveraged assets. They were arrogant, sloppy, and ripe for a fall. They'd overextended on a new tech venture, betting the family silver on a trend that was already showing signs of collapse. Charles, in his supreme confidence, had ignored every warning sign. He was still the boy who'd never been told no, and the market, I knew, was the ultimate disciplinarian. A man in a tuxedo that was a shade too tight approached me, his smile unctuous. A bold opening bid, Ms. Vasquez, the vintner will be pleased. He was one of them, a creature of this ecosystem, sniffing around a new potential source of capital. I gave him a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It's a sound investment," I replied, my tone implying I found his need to comment rather pedestrian. He blinked, slightly off balance, and retreated with a nod. This was the dance. I wasn't just bidding on a vineyard weekend. I was bidding on a position, a perception. Alina Vasquez was not a scorned woman. She was a player. From the corner of my eye, I saw Charles disentangle himself from a still-stricken Isabella. He was making his way toward me, his expression a forced mask of casual curiosity, though the rigid set of his shoulders betrayed him. This was the moment I had both dreaded and anticipated. The first real test. He stopped a few feet away, not invading my space, but claiming his own. "Alina Vasquez," he said, my name sounding foreign and strange on his lips. I must admit, that's a name I haven't heard in a long time, and a bid I wouldn't have expected from you. You see, a lavish weekend. I see a vineyard with a debt-to-equity ratio that makes it a prime acquisition target. Its owner is desperate for a liquidity injection. This bid isn't an expense. It's the first step in a conversation. He was looking at someone who understood the game he played, perhaps better than he did. The lesson, it seemed, was already being learned. The line went dead, and I held the sleek, silent phone in my hand, feeling the first solid ground beneath my feet in months. Mateo Vega. The name was a ghost from a life I'd almost forgotten, a whisper of polished leather and old cigar smoke. Calling him had been the greatest gamble, a desperate play based on a memory. I remembered him not as the reclusive titan he'd become, but as a sharp-eyed young man who'd stand a little too straight in my father's presence, his respect a tangible thing. My father had called him *integro, a man of integrity. It was the highest compliment he ever gave. Calling him had been the greatest gamble of this entire charade. I'd practiced the words until they felt like my own, until the tremor in my voice was replaced by a cool, analytical calm. But when I'd said, "Mateo, this is Alina Morales," the silence on the other end had been so profound and prolonged I feared the connection had been lost. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, sifting through decades. connecting the vibrant daughter of his revered mentor to the scandal-ridden name of Vasquez. When he finally spoke, his voice was older, graveled with time and authority. But the cadence was the same. Alina, he'd said, and the way he pronounced it, with the full weight of my maiden name behind it, felt like an absolution. I heard about your father, and I have watched, with disgust, what those *Hina's asterisks have done. He didn't need to name the Sterlings. Their reputation for stripping companies for parts preceded them. He despised their kind, seeing them as a corruption of the principled capitalism my father had embodied. I laid out my plan for him, not as a plea, but as a proposal. I talked about market saturation, about undervalued assets, about the precise psychological pressure points of Charles's new backers. I spoke the language of my father's world, a language I realized had been sleeping inside me all these years, waiting for its moment. I wasn't just selling him on revenge. I was offering him a shrewd investment, wrapped in the satisfying package of poetic justice. He listened, interjecting only with sharp, perceptive questions that proved he was already 10 steps ahead. He wasn't just hearing my words, he was evaluating the mind behind them. Your father, he said, his tone shifting into something softer, almost nostalgic, he would be proud of your clarity. He always said the best strategy was a simple one, built on a foundation of honor. What they did to you, it was a dishonor. Not just to you, but to his memory. Not just for the profit, though he made it clear he expected a significant return. He agreed to become my silent partner, my ghost in the machine, for the chance to settle an old score and honor an old debt. My father had given him his first real break. Mateo would now help secure his daughter's last. The resources he provided were staggering, a river of capital flowing through untraceable channels into the shell corporations my analyst had helped me establish. But it was more than money, it was access. A name whispered in the right ear. A piece of intelligence about a rival's weakness, delivered via an encrypted server. Mateo was the key that unlocked a world I had only been knocking on the door of. Back in the glittering gala, facing Charles, I felt the power of that alliance solidifying my spine. When I looked at him and saw not my husband, but a failing business prospect, it was Mateo's analytical coldness I channeled. When I spoke of debt-to-equity ratios and acquisition targets, it was with the confidence of someone who now had the backing to make such words a reality. Charles's face, a canvas of collapsing arrogance, was the first true validation of my new reality. He retreated, his mask of casual curiosity shattered, and I was left standing in the hum of the crowd. Isabella was watching me now, her expression a complex mix of fear and a strange, nascent respect. The scorned wife didn't command that a rival did. I turned away from them both, allowing myself a small, private smile as I plucked a flute of champagne from a passing tray. The bubbles were sharp and sweet on my tongue. This was no longer just my fight. It was a legacy. I was no longer just Alina Vasquez, the wronged woman. I was Alina Morales, my father's daughter, with a ghost in my corner and a war to win. The first battle was over. The lesson had been delivered. Now, the real game could begin. I could feel it, a current of purpose electrifying the air around me, the quiet, steady hum of the machine coming to life. The hum of the machine was no longer a quiet promise in my ear. It was the roar of a distant avalanche I had triggered. With Mateo's resources, a river of dark capital and darker intelligence, we made our first move. It wasn't a grand, public declaration. That was Charles's style, all bluster and bravado. Mine was a surgeon's cut, precise, invisible, until the patient realized they were already bleeding out. I had identified a key international supplier for Sterling Holdings, a company based in Singapore that provided a rare proprietary polymer essential for their flagship line of unbreakable sports equipment. It was a tiny, intricate cog in the vast Sterling machine, but one that, if jammed, would grind the entire mechanism to a halt. Through a dizzying series of shell corporations, a matryoshka doll of corporate entities, my analyst had helped me construct. We anonymously acquired a controlling interest in that supplier. The purchase was buried under layers of paperwork and offshore accounts, a ghost transaction. Then I gave the order. Not with malice, but with the dispassionate tone I'd learned from Matteo. I instructed the newly compliant board of the supplier to strategically delay a crucial shipment to Sterling's main manufacturing plant in Ohio. The reason given was a bland, unassailable, unforeseen logistical issues. A storm in the South China Sea, a paperwork snafu at the porta, kind of mundane corporate gremlins that executives curse but ultimately accept. The delay was a pebble. The ripple effect, however, was a tidal wave. I watched it unfold from the cool, minimalist sanctuary of my new command center, an apartment high above the city that Matteo's network had secured. It wasn't just an apartment. It was a bunker, a cockpit. Screens glowed with real-time financial data, news feeds, and a secure chat window where Matteo was a silent, ever-present specter. He didn't offer praise or critique. His presence was simply data, a confirmation that the parameters of the plan were being met. The first sign of success was a minor dip in Sterling's stock price. Then the financial blogs picked up a whisper from an anonymous source about potential supply chain vulnerabilities. The whisper became a murmur. A week after the shipment failed to arrive, Sterling was forced to issue a press release, a masterpiece of corporate weasel wording that tried to project strength while quietly announcing a temporary production halt. They were bleeding millions per day in idle factory costs and missed delivery deadlines. The true victory, however, wasn't on the ticker tape. It was in the human reaction. My private line, the one Charles didn't know I still monitored, lit up with frantic calls from his CFO. I listened to the voicemails, the man's voice climbing an octave with each passing day. "Charles, we have clients screaming, they're threatening to walk. This is a reputational nightmare. Such a shame. The market is so brutal these days." I didn't reply. My silence was a weapon. The scorned wife would have responded with a catty remark or feigned concern. A rival says nothing, because a rival is already planning the next move. Recostando-me na cadeira, girei para encarar a cidade. O horizonte cintilante já não era apenas uma vista. O rosto do meu pai surgiu na memória, não como o homem abatido do final, mas em seu auge, ensinando-me xadrez. Ele moveu o cavalo, capturando minha dama com sorriso gentil e apologético. Os ataques mais poderosos, Misha, geralmente vêm de onde seu oponente não está olhando, ele dissera. Este atraso no carregamento era exatamente aquele movimento inesperado. This shipment delay was that pawn move. It was a test of our machinery, of Matteo's web and my nerve, and it had worked flawlessly. Charles was scrambling, looking for a fire to put out, while I was the one who held the matches and the gasoline. The taste of champagne from the gala was a distant memory, replaced now by the sharp, clean flavor of cold-brewed coffee and absolute control. This was no longer about revenge, not in the petty sense. It was about reclamation. I was dismantling his kingdom brick by brick, and I was using his own blueprint ruthless corporate warfare to do it. The first battle had been a declaration. This was the first true casualty, and the war, I knew, had only just begun. The machine was alive and it was hungry. Just as I predicted, the Sterling's arrogance was their blind spot. They blamed the supplier's incompetence and never once imagined an outside force was at play. At a tense family dinner that Isabella begged me to attend to make peace, Preston, trying to impress his father, boasted loudly about a massive confidential merger that would solve all their recent financial troubles. He laid out their entire strategy, dismissing my presence as if I were a piece of furniture. It was the mistake I was waiting for. I sat there, a specter at their feast, toying with the stem of my wineglass. The baccarat crystal was cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the heat of their self-congratulatory bubble. Isabella had arranged the seating with the precision of a battlefield general, placing me as far from Charles as possible, flanked by her and a vapid cousin whose only contribution to the conversation was a critique of the saffron risotto. It was a gilded cage, and they thought I was the one trapped inside. Charles held court at the head of the table, a king surveying a realm he still believed was secure. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, passed over me without a flicker of recognition. I was part of the scenery now, the scorned woman his wife had taken pity on. He was already moving past the shipping delay, treating it as a temporary, irritating blip. Preston, flushed with a fine burgundy and his own perceived brilliance, was all too eager to be the heir apparent restoring order. "It's called Project Chimera," Preston announced. Leaning forward, his voice a conspiratorial stage whisper that carried to every corner of the opulent dining room, a reverse merger with Ethelred Holdings. They're a private equity shell, but their cash reserves are biblical. We absorb them, their capital becomes ours, and we not only shore up the losses from the last quarter, we acquire their stake in the new Baltic shipping lanes. It's a vertical integration play that will make us untouchable. It would spook the smaller investors we need to squeeze out. Public companies were lumbering giants, every move scrutinized. Private shells were shadows, and shadows were where Matteo spiders thrived. Isabella, sensing my silence, misinterpreted it for discomfort. "Darling, you must try the turbot," she trilled, her voice a little too bright. "It's flown in from the Mediterranean daily. A little taste of sun in this dreary weather." She was trying to reassert normalcy, to paint over the cracks in their foundation with a layer of caviar and forced cheer. "It's exquisite," I replied, my voice a soft, neutral thing. I met her eyes for a brief second, and I saw a flicker of something, they're not suspicion, but a faint, nagging confusion. She was the social barometer, and my calm was a pressure she couldn't read. The scorned wife should have been brittle, envious, or at least visibly wounded by their exclusive talk. My placid attention was a language she didn't understand. The rest of the dinner was a study in surrealism. They discussed yachts, a charity auction, the scandalous divorce of a mutual acquaintance, the trivial gossip of the terminally privileged. All the while, the name Ethelred echoed in my mind, a sacred chant. I was mapping the digital heist in Matteo could peel back the layers of a private shell in hours. We would find their weaknesses, their hidden debts, their silent partners. We could leak it, sabotage it, or, more elegantly, beat them to the punch. As the dessert course was cleared a chocolate soufflé that tasted like ash on my tongue, Charles finally addressed me directly. It wasn't a question, but a pronouncement. "I trust you're managing, all right. The transition can be difficult. In fact, I find I have a renewed sense of purpose." They were guarding their king and queen, looking for the obvious threats. But I was no longer a piece on their board. I was the hand moving the pawns. And Project Chimera, it was already mine. The machine was alive, it was hungry, and I had just fed it a king's ransom. The satisfaction was a cold, sharp thing in my chest. We had done it. Matteo's digital burglary, combined with the old-world clout of the Silvanema name my father had carved from ambition and jungle steel, had been an unstoppable combination. The Brazilian conglomerate, valuing lineage and discretion over new money arrogance, accepted our proposal with a palpable sense of relief. They had been uneasy with the Sterlings from the start. Our offer was formally accepted at 4:17 p.m. The Sterling Foundation Gala was scheduled to begin at 7 p.m. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of my new study, a space I had stripped of Charles's bland, corporate art and filled with my own things. A pre-Columbian pottery shard, a framed geological survey map of the Minas Gerais region, the scent of old books and fresh coffee. The city below was beginning to sparkle, a circuit board coming to life. Somewhere amidst those glittering towers, Charles and Preston were putting the final touches on their victory speech. Straightening their tuxedos, believing the world was still bending to their will. A part of me, the part they had tried to sculpt into a docile ornament, whispered that this was enough. We had one. We had beaten them to the punch, secured the deal, cost them a fortune in potential growth. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The machine, my machine, Chimera, hummed in the periphery of my consciousness, its logic cold and absolute. A tactical victory was not a strategic one. Leaving an enemy with a public platform and a wounded ego was a miscalculation. It created a narrative vacuum, and nature, especially the nature of men like the Sterling Zapors. A vacuum. They would spin the loss, find a scapegoat, and regroup. They would paint me as a vindictive woman, a spurned wife lashing out, my success a fluke of emotion rather than a result of superior strategy. No, a lesson needed to be administered, not in the shadows, but in the blinding glare of the spotlight they loved so much. They had to fall from the highest possible height onto the hardest possible surface. Their own stage. "Matteo," I said, my voice calm in the quiet room. I didn't need to raise it. He was patched in through the discreet comms unit nestled in my ear, a far cry from the clumsy hardware of my first visit to his lair. "I'm here, boss." His tone was all business, but I could hear the giddy anticipation underneath. He was an artist, and I was giving him the Louvre for his exhibition. "The package is ready. Preston has a real gift for confessing his sins when he thinks he's boasting." He paused. "You're sure about the delivery system? We could just dump it to the press. It would be easier." A tailored, severe black pantsuit, no jewelry, save for a single, heavy platinum cuff that housed a few crucial pieces of Matteo's tech. My armor. "I'm going in." It was about ontology. Charles had tried to define me as a widow, a problem, a transition. He had filed me away. Tonight, I would author my own definition, in fire and shattered glass. The Sterling Gala was a universe of its own, a contained ecosystem of wealth and influence, held within the gilded ballroom of the Metropolis Club. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, a familiar face no one truly saw. I accepted a glass of champagne I wouldn't drink and navigated the sea of silk and self-congratulation. I saw Isabella first, holding court near a towering ice sculpture, her laugh a little too bright, her eyes scanning the room for threats. She was guarding her king, and there he was. Charles stood near the podium, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing calmly as he spoke with a cluster of older, influential board members. He looked a picture of assured power, his smile easy, his posture relaxed. He believed the merger was a few hours from being announced, the crowning achievement of his reign. He had no idea the corpse of that deal was already cooling in a boardroom in São Paulo. I found a vantage point near the back, a shadow in an alcove, partially obscured by a large floral arrangement. The air was thick with perfume and the cloying sweetness of unearned triumph. I watched as Preston Sterling, flushed with pre-victory champagne, clapped his brother on the back. I saw Charles's phone vibrate in his pocket. He ignored it, then another, and another. A ripple of unease began to spread through his inner circle as more phones lit up. The news was breaking. The Brazilian deal was dead. The Silva Group had won. I saw the exact moment the understanding hit Charles. His smile didn't fall. It calcified on his face, a brittle mask. His eyes, for one unguarded second, widened with a shock so profound it looked like physical pain. He turned, his gaze sweeping the crowd, not looking for a face, but for a source, a reason. His eyes passed over me, through me, the invisible woman. Then it was time. The master of ceremonies, a bloated news anchor, took the podium to introduce Charles for his annual address. The applause was polite, expectant. Charles walked to the microphone, his steps slower than usual, the weight of the catastrophe already bowing his shoulders. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "Friends, colleagues, thank you for coming," he began, his voice lacking its usual resonant confidence. He was adrift, trying to find his footing on a cliff that had already crumbled away beneath him. This was my moment. I tapped my platinum cuff twice. In my ear, Matteo whispered, "Feed is live. You're on in 3, 2, 1. You know that The offshore accounts in the Caymans are just prudent risk management. Ethelred is the key. It's a black box, a ghost. The SEC can't trace what doesn't officially exist. Asterisk. I didn't look at the screens. I didn't look at the stunned, frozen faces of the elite. I kept my eyes locked on Charles. He saw me then, truly saw me. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw the shattering of his entire world. The bewildered stares I had felt on my back as I left his dining room were nothing compared to the laser focus of this entire gathering now fixed on me. I was no longer moving pawns. I was the queen, and I had just declared checkmate. I stopped a dozen feet from the podium. The recorded confession of his brother, his partner, his accomplice, continued to spill its secrets to the world. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply let him look at me, let him see the calm, inexorable force he had so carelessly unleashed. The hand, no longer moving pieces in the dark, was now pointing a finger from the center of the board, and the whole world was watching. The crimson silk felt like both armor and a declaration. Isabella had been pleased when I accepted her gift of attending, her voice dripping with condescending relief. She thought she was witnessing my surrender. Little did she know I was the architect of their downfall, ready for my final performance. For the first hour, I was a ghost. I drifted through the glittering throng, a silent, smiling specter at their feast. I accepted a flute of champagne I had no intention of drinking, the bubbles a mockery of the tension coiling in my gut. I saw Isabella from across the room, holding court near a towering ice sculpture, her smile brilliant and utterly vacant. She caught my eye and gave a slight, approving nod, a queen acknowledging a subject who had finally learned her place. I let my gaze slide away, a silent dismissal she was too self-absorbed to notice. My focus was on the dais, on the Sterling Foundation logo projected proudly behind the podium. It was a symbol I had once trusted, a beacon of my father's legacy that Charles and Preston had twisted into something monstrous. I found a spot in the shadows of a marble column, a vantage point that gave me a clear view of the stage and the main aisle leading to it. I waited. The hum of self-congratulatory chatter was a dissonant symphony to my ears. Then Charles took the stage. His voice, smooth and resonant, filled the room, weaving a tapestry of lies so intricate they almost gleamed with truth. He spoke of integrity, of his father's vision, of the unshakable ethical foundation upon which their empire was built. Each word was a carefully polished stone laid upon my father's grave. I watched his hands, those elegant, deceptive hands, gesture with practiced sincerity. He was so confident, so utterly in control, a king secure on his throne. My phone, a cheap, anonymous burner, felt heavy in my clutch. The signal was a simple one. A single button press relayed through a series of encrypted servers to a laptop manned by a hacker whose loyalty I'd purchased not with money, but with the promise of burning a corrupt system to the ground. My thumb rested on the screen, a queen poised over a square, ready to make the move that would end the game. The moment Charles mentioned my father's name, a sacrilege on his lips, I pressed it. The Sterling Foundation logo flickered, a digital gasp, and went black. A collective, confused murmur rippled through the ballroom, a wave of disrupted complacency. Charles stopped speaking, his brow furrowing, as he turned to look at the void behind him. Then, Preston's voice, slick and arrogant, filled the hall. Perfectly synced with the text messages and financial transfers now scrolling down the screens in damning green text. Asterisk, the old man's rules are for public consumption. Charles, you know that. The offshore accounts in the Caymans are just prudent risk management. Ethelred is the key. It's a black box, a ghost. The SEC can't trace what doesn't officially exist. Asterisk. Then, silence. A dead, crushing silence that swallowed the very oxygen in the room. It was the sound of a fantasy dissolving. Charles was staring at the screen, his face a ghastly white, a mask of horror where confidence had been moments before. He looked like a man watching his own ghost, his reflection in a shattered mirror. That was my cue. I stepped out of the shadows and into the aisle. I walked slowly, deliberately, the sharp, solitary click of my heels, the only sound in the horrified room. I didn't look at the screens, broadcasting their crimes. I didn't look at the stunned, frozen faces of the elite, their jewels and finery suddenly seeming like the trappings of a gaudy wake. I kept my eyes locked on Charles, a hunter sighting her prey. He saw me then. Truly saw me. His eyes, wide with dawning comprehension, met mine, and in them I saw the shattering of his entire world. The bewildered stares I had felt on my back as I left his dining room, dismissed as the hysterical daughter, were nothing compared to the laser focus of this entire gathering now fixed on me. I was no longer moving pawns in the dark, a hidden strategist. I was the queen, and I had just declared checkmate. I stopped a dozen feet from the podium, a chasm of polished floor between us. The recorded confession of his brother, his partner, his accomplice, continued to spill its secrets to the world, a relentless audio scourge. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I simply let him look at me, let him see the calm, inexorable force he had so carelessly unleashed when he decided my silence could be bought with pity and a minor executive title. I was the living embodiment of his miscalculation. The hand, no longer moving pieces in the dark, was now pointing a finger from the center of the board, and the whole world was watching. I held his gaze, this man who had reduced my father's life's work to a criminal enterprise, and I felt a profound, terrifying stillness. This wasn't the end of the game, it was the beginning. And for the first time, I was playing my pieces in the light. The words hung in the air, no longer a shard of glass in my heart, but a scalpel in my hand. Isabella's face, a perfect mask of casual cruelty, was the final piece of evidence I needed. I didn't flinch or look away. I simply absorbed the moment, letting the silence between us thicken. Her condescension wasn't an insult. It was her final act in a trial she didn't know she was facing. My silence wasn't the paralysis of pain, but the deep, steady breath a hunter takes before the kill. I watched her sever the last thread of our bond, completely unaware that she was handing me the scissors. I let a slow, deliberate smile touch my lips, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. It was a predator's smile, and for the first time I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. She had expected tears or a hissed retort, the familiar script of our fractured relationship. She did not expect this chilling calm. "Thank you, Isabella," I said, my voice low and clear, carrying in the sudden hush that had fallen around our little island of tension, for so clearly illustrating the problem. This was an execution in a room of potential allies, or at least fascinated spectators. The air was different here, charged not with horror, but with a voracious curiosity. I felt their eyes on me, the same elite crowd, their jewels glittering like the eyes of jungle cats. They had seen the fall of Charles Harrington. They had witnessed the quiet, unassuming woman from the Charity Foundation reveal herself as the architect of his ruin. Now, they watched to see what I would break next. I walked towards the small, raised dais, where a string quartet had been playing earlier. The music had died away, the musicians watching me with wide, apprehensive eyes. I didn't need a microphone. The room was so quiet I could hear the rustle of my own dress, a deep crimson that seemed to drink the light. I stopped at the edge of the dais, turning to face them all. I let my gaze sweep over the crowd, meeting the stairs head. I saw Isabella near the back, her face pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Charles was not here, of course. His world was a courtroom and a prison cell now. But his spirit, his toxic legacy of prejudice and casual erasure, was here in the marrow of this room. "My mother," I began, my voice ringing in the cavernous space, "was a visionary. She wasn't just a designer, she was a storyteller. She wove the vibrancy of her heritage, the soul of a people who understood color and life in a way this monochrome world could never grasp, into every stitch, every pattern. She didn't just create clothes, she created armor for the spirit. She built Santiago from a single sewing machine in a sunlit room to an international emblem of artistry. And when she was gone, her name, her legacy, was left in the care of men like Charles Harrington. Men who saw her life's work not as a legacy to protect, but as an asset to strip. They sanded down the edges, muted the colors, diluted the soul. They made it palatable. They made it safe for rooms like this one. They taught a new generation, my generation, to be ashamed of that vibrancy, to see it as too much, too ethnic. I let the phrase hang, ugly and exposed. They taught us that to be accepted, we had to become ghosts of ourselves, haunting the halls of our own inheritance. The secrets were all out in the open now. Instead, I held up a single laminated sketch. It was one of my mother's earliest designs for the original Santiago logo, a bold, stylized phoenix, woven from traditional Andean motifs, a design Harrington had scrapped for something more sterile and corporate. The hand is no longer pointing from the shadows, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper that forced them to listen all the harder. I am done playing their game on their board. I am not here to accuse one woman of a careless insult. I am here to accuse an entire system of a calculated crime. The crime of theft. The theft of a soul. You traded brilliance for safety, and you called it taste. It will be called Ignacia. It will be loud, it will be vibrant, it will be unapologetic. And it will be built on the simple, revolutionary principle that some things are not meant to be made palatable, some things are meant to be unforgettable. The game was indeed over. I had not just checkmated the king, I had set the entire board on fire, and from its ashes I would build my own. The silence following Mateo's revelation was profound. Charles stood frozen at the podium, his mouth slack with disbelief, the phone in his hand buzzing like a trapped insect. At their table, Margaret had a hand pressed to her throat, her face pale as parchment. But it was Isabella's look of pure betrayal that caused the only crack in my absolute calm. My gaze swept over the Sterling family's table. It was a study in collapsing dynasties. Margaret, Preston's mother, had a hand pressed to her throat, her face the color of old parchment. Preston himself was staring at the screen, at my mother's youthful, defiant face, his expression not one of anger, but of a profound, dawning confusion, as if he were trying to solve a complex equation he'd only just been given. And then there was Isabella, my daughter. Her face, turned toward the stage where Mateo stood, was a mask of pure, undiluted betrayal. It was the only thing that caused a flicker in the stillness inside me, a tiny, sharp crack in the ice. But it was a necessary wound. I did not wait for the chaos to find its voice. I began to walk. The click of my heels on the polished marble floor was a deliberate metronome, measuring the death of one era and the birth of another. I moved down the central aisle, a path that, just an hour ago, I was supposed to have walked in white silk, a docile lamb to the slaughter of their expectations. Now, I walked it in the color of mourning and rebellion, a queen claiming a conquered kingdom. Heads turned as I passed, a wave of rustling fabric and stunned whispers. I ignored them all. My focus was on the stage, on Arthur Sterling's crumbling form, on Mateo's steady, waiting presence. He offered me the microphone as I ascended the steps, his eyes holding a quiet, fierce pride. Our fingers brushed during the exchange, a fleeting, electric contact that was our only communication. It was enough. I turned to face the crowd, the microphone cool in my hand. The spotlight was hot and blinding, but I welcomed it. Let them see me. Let them see her. You were expecting a wedding, I began, my voice echoing in the vast, silent hall. It was not loud, but it carried, a clean, sharp blade cutting through the tension. A merger. The consolidation of power, neatly packaged in lace and lies. You were told a story about legacy and union. But that story, like so many others you cherish, was a forgery. He flinched as if struck. The merger with Sterling Global is not proceeding. The international venture you just announced, the one that was to be the crown jewel of your bold new future. It belongs to me, to Morale's Golden Harvests. The contracts were signed this morning. The digital signatures you all just received on your phones are the legal confirmation. Your board has already been notified. The deal is done. It was biding its time. And so was I. And when men like Charles Harrington, and yes, like you, Arthur, took the helm, you didn't just change the strategy. You performed a selectomy. You sanded down the edges, muted the colors, and packaged the hollowed-out corpse as refined taste. You traded brilliance for safety, and you called it good business. They remembered the fire. I am not here to take over the company my mother built, I announced, the words ringing with a finality that felt like a slamming door. That company, as she envisioned it, is dead. It died the day men like you decided the Morale's name was worth more than the Morale's vision. It will be called Ignacia. It will be loud, it will be vibrant, it will be unapologetic. And it will be built on the simple, revolutionary principle that some things are not meant to be made palatable, some things are meant to be unforgettable. It hit the stage with a dull, resonant thud that echoed through the sound system, a punctuation mark to the end of their world. I stepped down from the dais. I didn't look at Arthur's ashen face. I didn't look at Margaret's horrified stare. And I absolutely did not let my eyes wander to my daughter. To the wreckage of the future I had just burned to the ground for her, for me, for my mother. I walked back up the aisle, the same path, but this time I was walking away from the ashes. The crowd parted before me, a sea of stunned faces and silent calculations. The game was indeed over. I had not just checkmated the king, I had set the entire board on fire, and from its ashes I was already building my own. The first stone was laid. Its name was Ignacia, and it would be a inferno of our own making. The silence that followed the thud of the microphone was a living thing, thick and heavy, a vacuum that swallowed the air from the room. It was more profound than any applause could ever be. I walked back up the aisle, no longer a prisoner marching to my execution, but a queen surveying conquered territory. The stunned faces were my subjects, their silent calculations my tribute. I didn't see people, I saw dominoes, still wobbling from the initial push, waiting to fall in a chain reaction of ruin. I kept my gaze fixed on the exit, unable to look at Isabella, her shocked, betrayed expression already seared behind my eyelids. I didn't look at Isabella. I couldn't. The image of her face, a pale moon of shock and betrayal, was already seared onto the back of my eyelids. To see it again, in the flesh, would be to feel the first crack in my own foundation. So I kept my gaze fixed on the double doors at the back of the ballroom, my exit, my genesis. The spotlight, that cruel, exposing eye, had died the moment I stepped off the stage, plunging the room back into the chandelier's gilded hypocrisy. I pushed through the doors, and the humid night air of Miami hit me like a physical blow. A welcome shock after the sterile, refrigerated atmosphere of the tomb I'd just left behind. The sound of the ocean, a distant, rhythmic roar, was the only applause I needed. My driver, Carlos, stood waiting by the open door of the town car, his face impassive. He had been my mother's driver before me. He knew. The office. Dona Morales? He asked, his voice a low rumble. No, Carlos. The warehouse, I said, sliding into the cool leather interior. The new one. It was a glowing jewel box of lies, and inside, my daughter was learning that her entire life had been a carefully curated exhibit. I had not just ruined the Sterlings, I had detonated her world. The guilt was a sharp, cold stone in my gut, but I had chosen it. I had chosen the greater wreckage to save her from the slow, genteel poison they offered. The drive was a blur of neon and shadow. We left the glittering South Beach skyline behind, moving into the grittier, more authentic pulse of Little Havana. The warehouse was unassuming, a weathered brick building with a faded mural of a Cuban coffee farmer on its side. I'd purchased it 6 months ago under a shell corporation, a ghost of a plan that was now roaring to life. Inside, it was a cathedral of potential, exposed brick, high ceilings with rusted iron beams, and concrete floors stained from a forgotten industry. In the center of the vast empty space stood a single makeshift tabula door placed on two sawhorses. On it sat a laptop, a sleek phone, and a thick, bound manuscript, the business plan for Ignacia. My team was already there. Sophia, my lead designer, a whirlwind of creative energy with ink-stained fingers, was pacing, talking rapidly into her headset. Marco, my tech and security guru, was hunched over the laptop, his screens a cascade of code and financial models. They fell silent as I entered. The gravity of what had just happened on national television settled over them. "The dossier?" I asked, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Secured delivery to the SEC, the FTC's three major news outlets, 30 seconds before you took the stage," Marco confirmed without looking up. "The first headlines are hitting the wires now. Sterling Corp implodes, whistleblower reveals systemic fraud. Their stock has been halted. It's a bloodbath. Only one person had the number," I answered. "You burned it all down." Arthur's voice was a ragged whisper, stripped of all its former power. I could hear the chaos of the hotel suite behind him, shouting, crying, the shatter of glass. "My company, my life. What have you done to your own daughter?" I wanted to use colors that don't have names yet. I want the fabrics to tell stories of rebellion and resilience. I walked to the large grime-caked window that overlooked the street. The world outside was continuing, oblivious. But in here, in this raw, unfinished space, a new reality was being coded, sketched, and willed into existence. The silence of the warehouse was different from the silence of the ballroom. That had been an ending. This was a beginning. It was the quiet hum of a machine powering up, the focused breath before a battle cry. I had not just set the board on fire. I had taken the most valuable piece, my own identity, my own legacy, and I had moved it to a new board entirely. The Sterlings were finished, their name a synonym for corruption and failure. But Isabella, her path was now a terrifying blank canvas. I had scorched the earth around her to give her fertile ground. Whether she would see it that way was a terror I would have to live with. For now, there was only the work. The relentless, unforgiving, glorious work of building an inferno. The first stone was laid. Its name was Ignacia, and the world was already watching it burn. In the weeks that followed, the aftermath was swift. Sterling Holdings crumbled under federal investigations and public disgrace. Preston, facing ruin and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, publicly renounced the engagement, a desperate attempt to distance his tarnished name from the scandal. He threw my family to the wolves, and the wolves were hungry. Isabella came to my apartment 2 days later. She didn't call. She just appeared at my door, a ghost in a rain-soaked couture dress that probably cost more than Sophia's annual salary. Her face was a mess of smeared mascara and raw, trembling grief. She looked like a shattered doll, the kind we were never allowed to play with as children for fear we'd break them. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me, the scent of expensive perfume and cold rain filling the sterile air of my minimalist space. "How could you let this happen?" she sobbed, collapsing onto my austere leather sofa as if her bones had turned to water. "He left me, Alara. He said I was a liability. Our family is a joke. We have nothing." Not the cold satisfaction I had anticipated, nor the pity her performance was designed to elicit. There was only a vast, humming emptiness, the same quiet that had filled the warehouse. This was just another part of the work. He was using you, Isabella. They all were. You were the shiny key to a vault that was already empty. You could have saved us. I simply watched her, this creature of polished surfaces, finally seeing the rot that had always festered beneath her feet. She had mistaken my silence for weakness, my strategic retreats for defeat. She had seen a queen content to stay in her corner of the board, never realizing I was playing a different game entirely. "You ruined us," she said, the shock giving way to a feeble spark of anger. "Your own family. I liberated us. I burned the gilded cage. You're just too terrified to see that you're free. Forgive me." My justice was not just about their downfall, but about her awakening. She had to learn the value of the blood that ran in her veins or blood, the blood of survivors and fighters that our parents had tried to dilute with champagne and trust funds. That lesson would not be an easy one. It would be carved into her with the shards of her broken life. I walked to the door and opened it. The message was clear. She rose unsteadily, her body seeming to fold in on itself. She paused on the threshold, a flicker of the old Isabella in her eyes, a hint of spite, of wounded pride. "What am I supposed to do now?" she whispered. "That," I said, closing the door slowly but firmly, "is entirely up to you." It was charged. It was the silence after the first strike of the match. I walked to my desk where a single, sleek monitor glowed. Marco's countdown clock for Ignacia ticked away relentlessly, a digital heartbeat. 6 days, 23 hours, and 14 minutes. A countdown to the first spark. Isabella's path was now a terrifying blank canvas. I had scorched the earth around her to give her fertile ground. Whether she would see it that way, whether she would pick up a brush or simply lie down in the ashes, was a terror I would have to live with. It was the one variable I couldn't control, the one piece on this new board whose move I couldn't predict. But for now, there was only the work. My phone buzzed. A message from Sophia. Attached was a single image, a dress design sketched in furious, elegant lines. It was all sharp angles and flowing, molten color, a garment that looked less like clothing and more like a weaponized sunrise. The fabric notes read, * liquid metal silk, woven with recycled Kevlar threads. The story, a phoenix that learned to breathe fire. The sleek, black phone felt cool against my ear as I navigated the final clauses of the multi-million-dollar trade deal. 6 months, my eyes drifted from the glowing contract on my tablet to the panoramic window and the Los Angeles skyline beyond. A jagged tapestry of steel and ambition washed in golden light. This new piece wasn't the absence of conflict, but the quiet presence of the woman reflected in the glass, her posture straight without rigidity, was finally wholly me.
Sí, Eduardo. El punto 3 es claro.
No hay espacio para ambigüedad, I said. My voice calm, firm. There was no room for ambiguity in my life anymore. Not in my contracts, not in my loyalties, not in the legacy I was forging. I ended the call. The silence that followed as deep and satisfying as the plush carpet under my feet. The office was a reflection of this new peace, spare, elegant, dominated by the view. A single, framed photograph sat on my desk. My mother, her smile not just warm, but fierce, her eyes holding a universe of quiet strength. Her name and mine, Morales, was once again spoken with a respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with integrity. This piece was the quiet certainty that the woman in the reflection of the window, the one in the impeccably tailored suit, her posture straight without being rigid, was finally, wholly, me. My intercom buzzed, a soft, unobtrusive chime. "Mr. Morales," my assistant's voice floated through. "Your 4:30 is here." A Ms. Valdez. The machine, as I'd once thought of it, was not just powered up. It was a roaring, beautiful engine of change. Her first collection, Phoenix, had taken the fashion world by storm, not just for its audacious designs, but for the story it told of resilience, of fire, of beauty forged in hardship. The dress she'd first sketched for me, the weaponized sunrise, now stood in a climate-controlled case in the lobby, a testament to that first terrifying spark. But my mind, as it so often did in these quiet moments of triumph, drifted to the other variable. The one piece I had set on a new board and been forced to let go. Isabella, a different kind of intelligence network, had kept me apprised. Not of corporate espionage, but of a human soul's slow, painful recalibration. The reports were never detailed, just fragments from a trusted source. She was safe. She was working. She was staying afloat. The most recent image in my mind was from a week ago. I'd been in a part of the city my driver rarely had cause to visit, stuck in traffic outside a bustling no-frills cafe. And there she was, Isabella. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, strands escaping to frame a face devoid of its once impeccable makeup. She wore a simple, clean apron over a plain t-shirt and jeans, holding a tray of dirty coffee cups. She wasn't the socialite, the conniving heiress, or even the broken woman in my guest room. She was a woman with an entry-level job, her shoulders set not in defiance or despair, but in a kind of weary focus. She was clearing a table, her movements efficient, her gaze downcast. Then, an older woman, her features speaking of a life lived hard and well, called out from behind the counter. Isabella looked up, and for a fleeting second, her face transformed. It wasn't a smile, not quite. It was a flicker of acknowledgement, of shared space, a moment of uncomplicated human connection. She nodded, said something I couldn't hear, and went back to work. That was the report that mattered. She was building a life from scratch. No trust fund, no manipulations, no safety net woven from lies. Just her own two hands and the terrifying, liberating blank canvas I had given her. She was finally, painfully, beginning to understand the profound, unassailable strength of the ethnic woman she was once so ashamed to call her mother. She was learning the weight of a dollar earned, the dignity of a tired body at the end of an honest day. The simple power in looking another person in the eye without a scheme behind her own. The lock clicking shut on my old apartment felt a lifetime away. The terror of her choice had been a constant, low-grade hum in my system for months. But watching her through that car window, a strange certainty had settled over me. She wasn't lying down in the ashes. She was sifting through them, patiently, learning what was worth keeping and what needed to be swept away. My phone lit up with a notification, a news alert. Morales Holdings secures landmark trade deal with Bogota Consortium. I swiped it away. The public victories were satisfying, but they were the echo. This quiet, private knowledge was the sound. Isabella was on her own journey, and for the first time, it was a journey I didn't need to chart or control. She had her path, I had mine, and the peace that came with that simple, hard-won truth was a currency no one could ever devalue. I had my name, I had my dignity, and she, at long last, had a chance to earn her own.